rain came down not as water, but as a liquid sheet of steel, cold and unforgiving. For 4 days it had hammered the world into a gray smear of mud and misery. Silas gripped the reins, his knuckles white beneath worn leather gloves, the brim of his hat channeling a steady river past his collar. His horse, old Solomon, trembled beneath him, not from the cold, but from the sheer oppressive weight of the storm. It was a day fit for no man or beast. But a fence line was down near the northern ridge, and cattle did not care for the weather. He was turning Solomon back toward the distant, solitary light of his cabin when he saw it, a smudge of color against the gray rock of an overhang, something that didn't belong. It was a sodden heap of fabric, barely distinguishable from the landscape, a discarded blanket, perhaps. But something made him pull Solomon to a halt, his gut tightening with a feeling he hadn't felt in years. Dread. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the grasping mud. Each step was a labor. As he drew closer, the heap resolved itself. It was not one shape, but several, huddled together for a warmth that had long since been stolen by the wind and rain. A woman, her face pale as bone and her dark hair plastered to her skull, was curled around a knot of smaller figures. She was awake, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it had burned past screaming into a silent, hollow plea. Around her were 5 small girls, their faces pinched and blue with cold. The oldest, perhaps 9, held the youngest, a toddler, inside her coat in a desperate, failing attempt to shield her. 2 others, twins by the look of them, shivered so violently their teeth made a faint chattering music against the roar of the storm. The 5th girl lay with her head in her mother's lap, unnervingly still. Silas's breath caught in his chest. He had seen hardship. He had seen death. He was a man who had buried his own wife and infant son not 5 years ago, a grief that had carved him into the lonely, silent man he now was. But this was a portrait of despair so absolute, it felt like a physical blow. The woman flinched as he approached, pulling the children tighter. A low, guttural sound, half whimper, half growl, escaped her raw throat. She was a she-wolf, brought to the brink, ready to defend her cubs with the last ounce of her strength. Silas stopped a few feet away, raising his hand slowly, palms open. He stripped off his oilskin duster, a gesture that left him instantly exposed to the biting deluge. The cold hit him like a fist, but he ignored it. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse, yet he fought to keep it low and steady, to not let it crack in the wind. "Ma'am, you can't stay here. You'll all perish." The woman's eyes, dark pools of exhaustion and fear, tracked his every move. She said nothing. He saw the flicker of understanding, but her distrust was a wall thicker than any stone. He couldn't blame her. The world had clearly done its worst to her. He looked at the girls, at their starved, skeletal faces and drenched clothes. He could count their ribs through the thin fabric. This wasn't just about the storm. This was days, maybe weeks of neglect. His heart, a thing he thought had turned to stone, fractured. The ghosts of his own lost family screamed at him from the wind. He could not turn away. He could not. He took another slow step forward. "I have a cabin, a fire, food. It's not far." Still, she said nothing, her body coiling tighter. He knew he had only one chance to break through her fear. He had to make her understand. He knelt, the cold mud soaking through his trousers instantly, bringing himself lower than her. He looked her directly in the eye, trying to pour every ounce of sincerity he possessed into his gaze. "I mean you no harm," he said, the words stark and simple against the howl of the elements. "When am I ever?" she said, her voice stark and simple against the howl of the elements. "I swear it on all that I hold sacred. But if you stay here, those children will not see the dawn." He saw the conflict in her eyes, the war between terror and a mother's fierce, desperate need to save her children. The still child in her lap gave a faint, weak cough. That small sound broke the spell. The woman's facade of defiance crumbled, and a single hot tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. "Please," she whispered, her voice a fragile rasp, the first word she had spoken. It was a word of complete and utter surrender. Silas nodded, a grin set to his jaw. The decision was made. He didn't know what trouble he was bringing to his door, what darkness had driven this family into the wilderness. He only knew that he wouldn't let them be consumed by it. He stood up, the rain plastering his own shirt to his skin. "All right then," he said, his voice now imbued with a purpose that had long been absent. "Come with me." Getting them to the cabin was an ordeal that tested the limits of his strength. Solomon, bless his sturdy heart, stood patient as Silas lifted the two weakest girls, the still one and the toddler, and placed them in the saddle. The woman, who gave her name as Alara, could barely stand. Silas had to half-carry her, his arm locked around her waist while she leaned on him, her frail weight a shocking burden. The other three girls clung to each other, stumbling through the mud, their eyes fixed on their mother and the man who was either their savior or a new kind of monster. The half-mile to his cabin felt like 100. The wind tore at them, trying to rip the children from the saddle, to pull Alara from his grasp. But Silas set his jaw and pushed on, a bulwark against the storm. He was no longer just a man walking in the rain. He was an ark, carrying the last remnants of a broken world to sanctuary. When the dark shape of the cabin finally emerged from the gray curtain of rain, a collective sigh of relief, faint as it was, went through the small group. He pushed open the heavy oak door, and a wave of dry, pine-scented air washed over them. It was dark inside, the embers in the hearth little more than a dying orange pulse. His first priority was fire. He settled Alara and the children on the bearskin rug before the hearth, his movements swift and sure. He worked the kindling, his hands steady, and within minutes, a small flame licked at the dry logs. The fire caught, crackling to life, casting dancing shadows on the walls and, more importantly, a growing circle of warmth. The children huddled toward it like moths to a flame, their shivering slowly beginning to subside. Silas turned his attention to them, his heart aching at their condition. They were skin and bone. He fetched the oldest blankets he had, ones that still smelled faintly of his late wife, Mary, and wrapped each child in one. He worked with a gentle efficiency, his large, calloused hands surprisingly deft. The girls were too weak to resist, their eyes following him with a mixture of fear and awe. He moved to their mother. Alara was slumped by the fire, her eyes half closed, her body trembling uncontrollably. He knelt beside her. "Ma'am, Alara, we need to get you out of those wet clothes." She flinched at his touch, a spark of the wild animal returning to her eyes. "I'll leave you be," he said quickly, understanding. He laid a thick wool blanket and a dry homespun shirt of his own beside her. "I'll fetch some water. You get yourself and the girls dry. There's a stew on the stove from yesterday. It's not much, but it's hot." He retreated to the small kitchen area, giving them the illusion of privacy. He worked the pump for water, his back to them, listening to the rustle of fabric and the soft murmurs of the mother encouraging her children. When he turned back, Alara was wearing his oversized shirt, which hung on her like a dress, and she was working to strip the wet rags from her daughters, wrapping them in the blankets. The sight stirred something deep within him. His cabin, a silent monument to his grief for 5 years, was suddenly filled with a fragile life. It felt right, and that scared him more than any storm. He heated the beef and barley stew, the rich aroma filling the small space. He ladled it into 5 small bowls and 1 large one, his hands shaking slightly. He hadn't served a meal to another soul in this house since Mary died. He brought the bowls over, placing them on the floor near the hearth. The girls stared at the steaming food as if it were a mirage. The oldest one looked at her mother, seeking permission. Alara gave a weak nod, and that was all the encouragement they needed. They ate with a desperate, heartbreaking hunger, scooping the stew into their mouths with their hands, not caring that it was hot. They didn't speak. The only sounds the scrape of tin in their own ravenous swallows. Alara ate more slowly, her movements stiff. After a few spoonfuls, she seemed to gain a bit of strength. She looked up at him, her dark eyes luminous in the firelight. The fear was still there, but now it was joined by something else, a fragile, tentative gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice still a ghost of itself. Silas just nodded, his throat thick with emotion. He retreated to his own chair by the fire, giving them space, watching over them like a silent guardian. The girls, their bellies finally full, succumbed to an exhaustion so deep it was almost like a coma. They fell asleep where they sat, curled into each other on the bearskin rug, their small chests rising and falling in a steady, peaceful rhythm. For what was likely the first time in days, Alara watched them, her face a mask of love and pain. She looked at Silas, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the deep lines of sorrow etched around his eyes, the stoop in his broad shoulders that had nothing to do with age. She saw a man as broken as she was. "He cast us out," she said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire and the drumming of the rain on the roof. My husband. He said we were a drain on his fortunes. He drove us from the house with nothing but the clothes on our backs. Silas's hands tightened into fists in his lap. He didn't ask for the story, but he knew she needed to tell it. He simply listened, his silence an invitation. 4 days ago, she continued, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. He said if God wanted us to survive, he'd provide. He called it a test of faith. Silas's jaw tightened. This wasn't a test of faith, this was murder, just slower and colder than a bullet. He looked at the 5 sleeping girls, innocent casualties in a cruel man's twisted world. He looked at their mother, a woman who had walked through hell and was still standing, if only barely. The external threat now had a name and a face in his mind. A husband. A monster. The rain beat against the windows, but inside the fire burned bright. For the first time in a long time, the cabin didn't feel empty. It felt like a fortress, and Silas knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that the war had just followed this broken family through his door. Dawn broke not with light, but with a lessening of the dark. The rain had softened to a persistent drizzle, and a gray, watery luminescence filtered through the cabin's windows. Silas was already awake. He hadn't slept, instead keeping vigil in his chair, adding logs to the fire and watching the small family that had taken over his hearth and his life. The girls began to stir one by one, their waking marked by soft whimpers and confused glances at the unfamiliar log walls. The oldest, whose name he learned was Clara, sat up first. She was her mother's daughter, her eyes immediately scanning for threats, her body tensing when she saw Silas watching them. He gave her a slow, deliberate nod and she relaxed slightly, pulling a blanket more snugly around her sleeping sisters. Ilara woke last. She pushed herself up with a groan, her body aching with a deep, settled chill and the exhaustion of her ordeal. For a moment she looked lost, her eyes darting around the room before they settled on her children, safe and warm by the fire. The relief that washed over her face was so powerful it was almost painful to watch. "Morning," Silas said quietly, not moving from his chair. "There's coffee on the stove, and I can make some oatmeal for the girls." Ilara simply nodded, still too overwhelmed to speak. She ran a hand over the forehead of the youngest, Rose, checking for fever. The child was still pale, but her skin was warm to the touch. While Ilara tended to her daughters, Silas moved about the kitchen area with a quiet economy of motion. He cooked a large pot of oatmeal, sweetening it with a dollop of precious molasses. The smell of it, warm and sweet, filled the cabin, the scent of simple domesticity that felt alien and yet deeply familiar. He served the girls first. They were shy in the daylight, their hunger from the night before replaced by a wary curiosity. They whispered amongst themselves, casting furtive glances at the large, quiet man who had given them food and shelter. He learned their names as Ilara spoke to them in a soft, reassuring voice. Clara, the solemn protector, Martha and Mary, the inseparable twins, Lily, who had a spark of defiance in her eyes, and little Rose, the fragile one. After the children had eaten, Silas handed a bowl to Ilara. She took it, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The contact was like a spark, a brief jolt of human connection in the insulated world he had built for himself. They sat in a comfortable silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle hiss of the rain and the soft breathing of the children. "My husband, his name is Elias," Ilara said, her voice stronger than it had been the night before. She stared into the fire as she spoke, as if the story were written in the flames. "He was not always this way. He was a good man once, a merchant in Blackwood Creek, but he made a bad investment, lost everything. The shame, it curdled him, turned him bitter." Silas listened, his expression unreadable. He knew of Blackwood Creek. It was 2 days' ride to the east, a hard place. "He started talking about purity," Ilara continued, her voice trembling slightly. "About sacrifice. He fell in with a traveling preacher who spoke of shedding worldly burdens. He began to see us, the girls and me, as burdens, as the cause of his failure. He said we were his trial, and to prove his faith to God, he had to cast us out. Let Providence decide our—" Silas's knuckles were white where he gripped his coffee cup. This was not just cruelty, it was a madness cloaked in piety, the most dangerous kind of evil. "He won't just let you go, will he?" Silas asked, the question hanging heavy in the air. Ilara shook her head, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "No. In his mind we are still his property, his trial. If we survive, he will see it as a sign that we are meant to be brought back under his control, to be broken properly this time. He will come looking. He will see our survival as defiance. There it was, the clear and present danger. It wasn't a band of outlaws or a corrupt lawman. It was a zealot, a man who believed his cruelty was ordained by heaven, a man who would hunt his own family to prove a point to his God. Silas stood and walked to the cabin's single window, pushing aside the simple calico curtain Mary had sewn years ago. He looked out at the rain-soaked landscape, the world a canvas of green and gray. His ranch, his sanctuary, had been breached. This was his home, the only thing he had left of his old life. He had defended it from wolves, from cattle rustlers, from the unforgiving march of nature itself. Now he had to defend it from a man's corrupted soul. He felt the weight of Alara's stare on his back. He was a stranger. She and her daughters owed him nothing, and he owed them nothing. He could tell them to leave when the storm broke, point them toward the next town, and wash his hands of it. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing, the lonely thing. But as he looked out the window, he didn't just see his land. He saw the faces of the 5 sleeping girls, their innocent lives now tethered to his. He heard the echo of his own son's laughter, a ghost in the corners of the cabin. He remembered the vow he had made to his wife, to always protect their family. He had failed then, powerless against a fever. He would not fail now. He turned back from the window, his decision made. His face was set like granite, the lines of grief around his eyes now lines of grim determination. He looked at Alara, his gaze steady and unwavering. "He will not find you," Silas said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of fact. "And if he does, he will find me waiting." In that moment, Alara saw past the grieving rancher. She saw the protector she and her daughters so desperately needed. She saw a man of honor, a man willing to stand against the darkness. For the first time in a long, long time, a flicker of hope ignited in her heart, a small, stubborn flame against the encroaching shadows. The storm broke on the second day. Sunlight, pale and tentative, pierced the clouds, making the wet world glitter. The air was clean, washed new. Inside the cabin, a quiet routine had begun to form. Alara, her strength slowly returning, insisted on helping. She mended the girls' torn clothes with a needle and thread from Silas's neglected sewing kit, her stitches small and perfect. Clara, the eldest daughter, took it upon herself to sweep the floor with a quiet, solemn efficiency that mirrored Silas's own. The twins, Martha and Mary, helped peel potatoes for a stew, their initial fear of the quiet rancher slowly dissolving into a shy curiosity. Silas watched it all from the periphery. The sounds of his cabin had changed. The oppressive silence had been replaced by the soft murmur of a mother's voice, the light patter of small feet, the occasional stifled giggle from one of the younger girls. It was a symphony of life he thought he would never hear again, and it both soothed and terrified him. That afternoon, he took Clara and Lily with him to check on the livestock. He needed to see how they would fare outside the cabin walls, how much the fear of the world still clung to them. Lily, her defiance returning with food and warmth, peppered him with questions about the horses, the chickens, the name of every rock and tree. Clara remained silent, her watchful eyes taking everything in. But when Silas showed her how to gently feed a handful of oats to Solomon, the corner of her mouth twitched into a small, hesitant smile. He saw in them a resilience that humbled him. They were not just victims. They were survivors, saplings that had bent in the storm but had not broken. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, curled together on a pallet of blankets Alara had made for them, she found Silas on the porch. He was cleaning his rifle, the oiled steel gleaming in the moonlight. The methodical, repetitive motion was something he did when his mind was troubled. Voices. "They are good children," he said without looking up, his voice a low rumble in the quiet of the night. "They are strong," Alara replied, leaning against the porch rail. She pulled the thick wool shawl he had given her tighter around her shoulders. "They have had to be." They stood in silence for a time, the vast, star-dusted sky stretching out above them. The world felt peaceful, almost deceptively so. "You have been kind to us, Silas," Alara said, her voice soft. "You've given us food, shelter, safety. I have no way to repay you." "There is nothing to repay," he said, finally looking up at her. His eyes were dark and serious. "A man does what is right. It's all he has to hold on to." He paused, setting the rifle aside. "This place, it was a tomb before you came. I was just waiting my turn to be buried in it. You and your girls, you've brought life back into these walls." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and honest. It was more than he had said to another living soul in 5 years. Ilara felt her heart ache for him, for the profound loneliness he had endured. "We have brought danger too," she said, her gaze turning toward the dark horizon to the east, the direction of Blackwood Creek. "Danger's always been here," he countered gruffly. "Comes in different forms, blizzards, wolves, sickness." He stood up and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the moonlit expanse of his land. "This is my home. What's mine, I protect. That's the code I live by." He turned back to face her, his large frame silhouetted against the night. "You are here now. The girls are here. That makes you part of what's mine to protect. Elias is not just your enemy anymore. He is mine too." This was the moment, the final spoken commitment. He was no longer just a man who had offered temporary shelter from a storm. He was a man making a stand. He was drawing a line in the dirt of his own land and daring the world to cross it. He was choosing to defend this broken family, knowing full well it could cost him everything. He was choosing to feel again, to fight again, to live again, even if it meant inviting pain and violence into his sanctuary. He reached for the heavy cabin door, his decision settling into his soul with the weight of an anchor. He had to close it, to secure the lock, to create a physical barrier between the world of sleeping children inside and the looming threat of the man who would hunt them. He put his hand on the wood, the promise he had just made echoing in his heart. He had made his choice, a decision that would bring danger to his door. As he closes that door, we hope you're enjoying this story of courage. If you are, taking a moment to like the video helps us bring more tales like this to you. Now, with the latch thrown, the real challenge began. A week passed, then another. The fragile life that had taken root in Silas's cabin began to grow stronger, its tendrils weaving into the fabric of his solitary existence. The fear in the children's eyes was replaced by the gleam of mischief and the light of discovery. They learned the rhythms of the ranch, the morning call of the rooster, the lowing of the cattle, the quiet hours of the afternoon when the sun baked the porch steps. Silas found himself in a new role, an unwitting and reluctant patriarch. He taught Lily how to whittle a piece of scrap wood into a clumsy-looking bird. He lifted little Rose onto Solomon's back and led her on slow, careful circuits around the corral, her squeals of delight a sound that chipped away at the ice around his heart. He found himself speaking more, the words coming easier now, his voice losing the rusty edge of disuse. Ilara, too, was transforming. With each nourishing meal, with each night of peaceful sleep, the gaunt, haunted woman who had collapsed at his door was receding. Color returned to her cheeks. Her body, though still slender, lost its brittle fragility. She moved with a newfound purpose, her hands always busy. She cooked and cleaned, not with the air of a servant repaying a debt, but as a woman making a home. She mended Silas's worn shirts, her stitches neat and strong. She even found Mary's old garden, overgrown and choked with weeds, and began the arduous task of reclaiming it, her hands in the soil as if trying to draw strength from the earth itself. One evening, Silas came in from the fields, tired and smelling of hay and sweat, to find the cabin filled with the scent of baking bread. Ilara stood at the counter, her hands dusted with flour, a faint smile on her lips as she watched the loaves rising in the oven. The scene was so powerfully, achingly domestic that it stopped him in his tracks. For a blinding moment it was Mary standing there, and the grief hit him with the force of a physical blow. He must have made a sound, because Ilara turned, her smile fading when she saw the look on his face. "Silas," she asked, her voice soft with concern, "are you all right?" He couldn't speak, just nodded, turning away to hang his hat on its peg. He felt her eyes on him, a gentle, questioning presence. It has been a long time since there was fresh bread in this house," he finally managed to say, his back still to her. She didn't press. She understood. She lived with ghosts of her own. "The girls found a sack of yeast in the pantry," she said quietly. "Deli begged me. It felt good to create something." Later that night, after they had all shared the warm, crusty bread with fresh butter, a silence settled between Silas and Ilara. The children were asleep, their bellies full, their faces peaceful in the firelight. "She must have been a good woman," Ilara said, her gaze on the neatly sewn curtains. "Your wife?" Silas looked up, surprised. He rarely spoke of Mary. The pain was still too close to the surface. But looking at Alara, at her compassionate, understanding eyes, he found himself wanting to. "She was," he said, his voice thick. "Her name was Mary. She was the light of this place. She could make anything grow. She loved this land as much as I do." He swallowed hard. "We had a son, Samuel. He had his mother's laugh. A fever took them both one winter. There was nothing I could do." He fell silent, the old guilt and helplessness washing over him. Alara reached out, her hand tentatively covering his own where it rested on the table. Her touch was warm, comforting. "I'm sorry, Silas," she whispered. "I thought the world ended that day," he confessed, his gaze locked on their joined hands. "I've just been living in the ruins ever since." "Perhaps," she said softly, "it is time to start rebuilding." Her words and the simple, profound gesture of her touch resonated deep within him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was betraying Mary's memory by feeling a connection to another. He felt, instead, a flicker of something he had long thought dead. Hope. The bond between them, forged in a storm and tempered in the quiet days that followed, was deepening. It was no longer just about protector and protected. It was about two broken souls finding solace in each other's company, a quiet promise of a new beginning blooming in the sanctuary of the ranch. The news came as it always did in the West, carried on the wind and the tongue of a stranger. Silas had ridden into the small settlement of dusty buildings that passed for a town, a place called Providence, for supplies. He did this only a few times a year, preferring his own company, but the flour was low and the girls needed things he couldn't grow or hunt. He was in the general store, the old proprietor, Jebediah, weighing out a sack of beans, when the man walked in. He was a trapper, Silas guessed from his buckskins, with a lean and hungry look about him. "Whiskey," the trapper grunted, throwing a few coins on the counter. Jebediah, a man who thrived on gossip, poured the drink. "Just come down from the east, have you, Tom?" "Aye," the trapper said, downing the whiskey in a single gulp. "Came through Blackwood Creek, strange place. Got a mad preacher type there stirring up trouble." Silas froze, his hand hovering over a bolt of calico cloth Alara had asked for. "That's so," Jebediah said, his eyes gleaming with interest. "Aye," Tom continued, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "Fella named Elias Thorne, talks of sacrifice and purity. Says the Lord told him to cast out his own wife and 5 daughters to test their faith. Now he's going around saying their survival is a miracle, a sign that he's meant to be a prophet." Silas's blood ran cold. "But that ain't the half of it," the trapper said, leaning on the counter. "He's convinced himself that some demon has captured his blessed family and is holding them against their will. He's been preaching that it's his holy mission to reclaim them, gathered a handful of other lost souls and fools to his cause. Says he's marching out to find them and cleanse them with fire and righteousness." Jebediah whistled low. "Sounds like a dangerous man." "He is that," the trapper affirmed. "Got the devil's own fire in his eyes. I'd hate to be the man who gets in his way." Silas paid for his supplies in a haze, his mind racing. He loaded the sacks onto his pack mule with grim, efficient movements. Elias wasn't just coming. He was coming with an army, a small one perhaps, but an army of zealots convinced they were doing God's work. They would see Silas not as a rescuer, but as a demon, a corrupting influence on a holy family. They wouldn't just want the family back, they would want to destroy him and everything he had built. The ride back to the ranch was a blur of dust and dread. The peaceful sanctuary he had so carefully cultivated now seemed terribly fragile, a tiny island of calm in the path of a tidal wave. The stakes had been raised to a level he hadn't anticipated. This was no longer just about one man. It was about a holy war, and his ranch was about to become the battlefield. He arrived as dusk was settling, the sky painted in hues of orange and purple. The warm yellow light from the cabin windows spilled out into the twilight, a beacon of home. He could hear the faint sound of the girls laughing inside, the sound which had become a comfort to him, now twisted in his gut like a knife. He walked in, his face a grim mask. Alara took one look at him and knew. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" she whispered. "What did you hear?" He didn't soften the blow. She deserved the truth. She had the right to know what was coming for them. "It's Elias," he said, his voice low and heavy. "He's coming, and he's not alone." He told her what the trapper had said. He watched as the color drained from her face, as the hope they had so carefully nurtured withered under the harsh glare of reality. The external threat was no longer a distant shadow on the horizon. It was a physical presence, a gathering storm, and it was marching directly toward them. The bond they had formed would now be tested by fire. Dread settled over the cabin like a shroud. The children, sensitive to the sudden shift in the atmosphere, grew quiet and watchful. The laughter and light of the previous weeks evaporated, replaced by hushed whispers and anxious glances toward their mother and Silas. Ilara was consumed by a chilling fear. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, had twisted into a monster who now hunted them under a banner of righteousness. She paced the cabin floor, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. "We should run," she said, her voice tight with panic. "We can pack what we can and leave before he gets here. Head west." "Disappear." Silas stood by the fireplace, staring into the flames, his expression unreadable. He let her speak, let the fear pour out of her. "Run where, Ilara?" he finally asked, his voice calm and steady, a rock in her sea of terror. "To another patch of wilderness? To starve in a different storm? He would hunt you. A man like that, a man convinced he's on a mission from God, he will never stop." He turned to face her, his eyes burning with a cold intensity. "Running is what he expects. It's what a demon would do. It would prove him right in his own twisted mind. There's only one way to end this. We stop him. Here." The finality in his voice was absolute. This was not a suggestion, it was a declaration. Ilara looked at him, at the set of his jaw, the hard lines of his face. She saw the protector, the man who had pulled them from the rain, but now she saw something more, a warrior. "How?" she asked, her voice a near whisper. "You are one man, he is coming with others." "This is my land," Silas said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "I know every rock, every ravine, every tree. This mountain is my fortress. He is coming into my world now. He will not be fighting one man. He will be fighting the land itself." From that moment on, a grim purpose took hold. Silas began to prepare for a siege. He was no longer just a rancher, he was a commander. He spent the days from dawn until dusk outside, not tending to his cattle, but fortifying his home. He boarded up the smaller windows, leaving only narrow slits for a rifle. He reinforced the main door with a heavy iron bar. He cleared brush from around the cabin, creating a wide open field of fire where no one could approach unseen. He took Ilara with him, showing her the hidden paths, the natural choke points in the valley, the high ground that offered a commanding view of the only approach to his ranch. He took her to a small hidden cave behind a waterfall, a place he had discovered as a boy. "If the worst happens," he said, his voice grim, "you bring the girls here. You do not stop and you do not look back. Do you understand?" She nodded, her heart pounding. This was real. This was a matter of life and death. One afternoon, he took her to a clearing far from the cabin. He pressed his spare rifle into her hands. It was heavy, the wood smooth and the steel cold. "I don't know how to use this," she said, her hands trembling. "You're going to learn," he said simply. He spent hours with her. He showed her how to load, how to aim, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to squeeze the trigger without flinching. Her first few shots were wild, kicking up dust far from the tin can he had set on a stump. She was frustrated, tears of anger and fear welling in her eyes. "I can't do this," she cried, lowering the rifle. Silas took a step closer. He didn't coddle her. He didn't offer false comfort. He looked her straight in the eye. "Yes, you can," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. "The woman who survived 4 days in a storm with 5 starving children can do anything. Elias made you a victim. I am showing you how not to be one. Now pick it up." Again, something inside her shifted. He was not just giving her a weapon. He was giving her back her own strength. He was showing her that she was not helpless. She took a deep breath, lifted the rifle, and aimed. This time, when she fired, the tin can jumped into the air. A small, fierce smile touched her lips. It was the first time she had smiled in days. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was joined by something else, resolve. Their bond, born of shared solitude and growing affection, was now being forged into something stronger in the crucible of shared purpose. They were no longer 2 separate people. They were partners, united against a common enemy. As they prepared for the coming battle, they found a strength in each other that neither of them knew they possessed. The ranch was no longer just a sanctuary. It had become a stronghold. The days bled into a week of tense waiting. Every gust of wind sounded like the footfalls of approaching men. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Silas pushed the children to play inside, to keep their voices down, a restriction that chafed their newfound freedom and added to the oppressive atmosphere. He spent his time on the ridge overlooking the valley, a spyglass to his eye, watching the eastern trail. He was a sentinel, a lone guardian on the walls of his kingdom. He came back to the cabin only for meals and to sleep, his face etched with a deeper weariness each day. During this time, it was Clara who stepped forward. The solemn, watchful girl became a second mother to her siblings. She read to them from the one book in Silas's cabin, a well-worn Bible, her soft voice a calming presence in the tense silence. She organized quiet games of marbles on the floor and helped Alara with the endless chores, her small face set with a seriousness that was far beyond her years. One evening, Silas was on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky when Clara came out and sat on the steps near him. For a long time she said nothing, simply sat with him in the twilight. "Are you scared?" she finally asked, her voice small. Silas lowered the spyglass and looked down at the young girl. He could lie, he could tell her everything was fine, but this child had seen too much of the world's cruelty for easy platitudes. She deserved the truth. "Yes," he said honestly, "I am. My father, Elias," she said, stumbling over the word father. "He says he is doing God's work." "Sometimes," Silas said, choosing his words carefully, "men get confused. They mistake their own anger and pride for the voice of God." Clara nodded, absorbing this. "You are a good man, Silas," she said with the simple, profound certainty of a child. "You saved us." "I just opened a door," he said gruffly, uncomfortable with the praise. "No," she insisted, turning to look at him, her dark eyes so much like her mother's. "You made us a home. You are protecting us. That is what a father does." The word hit Silas like a physical blow, stealing the air from his lungs. Father. It was a name he thought he would never hear again, a role he thought had been buried with his son. He looked at this brave, serious girl, and his heart, which had been so carefully guarded, cracked wide open. He felt a fierce, protective love for her, for all of them, that was as powerful and undeniable as his grief for his own lost family. He didn't know what to say. He simply reached out and rested his large, calloused hand on her small shoulder. It was a gesture of comfort, of solidarity, of a promise that he would not fail them. Later that night, long after the children were asleep, Alara found him by the hearth. The fire had burned down to embers, and the cabin was filled with a deep quiet. She came and stood beside him, their shoulders almost touching. "I saw you with Clara earlier," she said. "She believes in you." "She's a good girl," was all he could manage. "They all are," Alara said, her voice thick with emotion. "They have started to call you our Silas when they talk to each other. You are more than a protector to them. You are giving them back a world they can trust." He turned to look at her, the dim, glowing light of the embers softening the hard lines of his face. He saw the trust in her eyes, too, and something more, something that mirrored the tumultuous, unspoken feelings in his own chest. The terror of the coming fight was still there, but beneath it, a powerful current of tenderness was pulling them together. He reached out, his hand gently cupping her cheek. Her skin was soft beneath his rough fingers. She leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering closed for a moment. It was not a gesture of passion, but of profound, desperate connection. Two lonely, shipwrecked souls clinging to each other before the final storm broke. "Alara," he whispered, his voice raw. "I know," she whispered back, opening her eyes. "I'm scared." "I am too," he admitted, "but I will not let him harm you. I will not let him take you from this place." In the quiet of the cabin, surrounded by sleeping children, they stood on the precipice of a battle for their lives, their burgeoning love a fragile, defiant light against the encroaching darkness. The morning came, gray and breathless. There was a stillness in the air, a heavy silence that felt like the world holding its breath. Silas knew. He had felt it in his bones when he woke. Today was the day. He didn't need the spyglass. He saw them first as a dark line of ants crawling over the eastern ridge, 4 of them on horseback. One man, taller than the rest, rode slightly ahead, Elias. "They're here," Silas said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He stepped back from the ridge, his movements calm and deliberate. The waiting was over. The time for action had come. He returned to the cabin, his face a granite mask. "Elara, it's time. Take the girls. Go to the cave. Now." The panic flared in Elara's eyes, but she saw the iron resolve in his and knew there was no room for argument. She nodded, her face pale. "Be safe, Silas." "Just go," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for sentiment. She moved with a desperate efficiency, waking the children, her voice a low, urgent whisper. "Get your coats. We're going for a walk. Quickly now. It's a game." The girls, sensing the terrifying reality behind the words, scrambled to obey, their eyes wide and frightened. Clara took Rose in her arms, while Martha and Mary clung to Elara's skirt. Lily, ever defiant, looked from her mother to Silas, a question in her eyes. "Do what your mother says," Silas told her, his voice softer than he intended. Elara herded them toward a small back window they had prearranged as an escape route. Before she climbed out, she turned back, her eyes locking with Silas's across the room. In that one look, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Fear, hope, love, and a desperate plea. He gave her a single sharp nod. It was all the reassurance he could offer. Then she was gone, disappearing into the woods with the children. The cabin fell silent, terribly silent. Silas was alone again, but it was a different kind of solitude. It was the focused, alert loneliness of a hunter in his blind. He moved to the front window, peering through the narrow slit. Elias and his 3 followers were halfway across the valley. They rode slowly, arrogantly, as if they were on a Sunday procession. As they drew closer, he could make out their faces. They were not hardened outlaws. They were gaunt, wild-eyed men, their faces alight with a feverish, holy fervor. They were more dangerous than outlaws. They believed they were invincible, righteous. Elias reined in his horse about 100 yards from the cabin. He was a tall, thin man with a sparse, dark beard and eyes that burned with a chilling intensity. He raised a hand, and his followers stopped behind him. "Silas! Cain!" Elias's voice boomed across the clearing, a preacher's voice used to filling a tent with fire and brimstone. "You are known to me, a man of sorrow, hiding from the light of God. You have harbored my family, who are consecrated to the Lord. You have corrupted them with your worldly comforts." Silas remained silent, his rifle resting on the window ledge, its sight trained on Elias's chest. "Send out my wife Elara and my 5 blessed daughters," Elias commanded. "Their trial of faith is over. They have been delivered, and I am here to reclaim what is mine. Release them from your demonic grasp, and I may yet have mercy on your soul." Silas's jaw tightened. He thought of Elara and the girls huddled in a cold cave. He thought of the starvation and fear on their faces when he had found them. Mercy. This man knew nothing of the word. Slowly, deliberately, Silas pushed open the heavy cabin door and stepped out onto the porch. He held his rifle loosely in one hand, his posture relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. He wanted Elias to see him. He wanted him to know who he was dealing with. "They're not your property, Elias." Silas's voice was not loud, but it carried across the clearing with a deadly quiet. "They are human beings, and they are under my protection." Elias threw back his head and laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Protection? You offer the protection of the serpent? I come with the power of the Almighty. Lay down your weapons, sinner, and repent." "The only sin I see here," Silas said, raising his rifle and resting the stock against his shoulder, "is a man who would use God's name to justify his own cruelty." He sighted down the barrel, the small metal bead perfectly aligned with Elias's heart. "You are not welcome on this land. Turn around and ride away. This is your only warning." The first shot had been fired, not from a rifle, but with words. The lines were drawn. The confrontation, long dreaded, had finally begun. Elias's face contorted with rage. The calm defiance from the man on the porch was an insult to his divine authority. "You dare threaten a man of God?" he shrieked, his voice cracking with fury. "You have sealed your own damnation. Brothers, the demon shows his face. We will cleanse this place with fire." One of the followers, a young man with fever-bright eyes, spurred his horse forward, raising a torch that seemed to appear from nowhere, its flames licking hungrily at the air. He galloped toward the cabin, his intent clear, to set the dry wood of the porch ablaze. Silas didn't hesitate. He shifted his aim from Elias to the rider. He didn't aim for the man, but for the horse. He squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder, its report echoing like a thunderclap through the valley. The horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, and collapsed, its front leg shattered. The rider was thrown clear, landing hard in the dirt, the torch skittering away and extinguishing in the damp grass. The man clutched his shoulder, groaning, but he was alive. It was a warning shot, a demonstration of cold, calculated skill. "The next one will not be for the horse," Silas called out, his voice steady. Elias and his other two followers stared, momentarily stunned by the sudden, brutal violence. They had expected a sinner who would cower before their righteousness, not a marksman of deadly precision. "He is but one man," Elias bellowed, recovering himself. "Spread out! He cannot watch all sides." The remaining two riders broke apart, circling to the sides of the cabin, seeking a blind spot. Silas stepped back into the doorway, the darkness of the cabin swallowing him. He was no longer a static target. He moved from one boarded window to another, a ghost in his own home. He caught a glimpse of a rider dismounting near the barn, using it for cover. Silas fired again, the bullet splintering the wood of the barn door inches from the man's head. The man yelped and scrambled back, his fervor dimming in the face of near death. The fight became a deadly game of cat and mouse. Elias stayed back, directing his followers, screaming scripture and curses in equal measure. The two men on foot tried to advance, darting from the cover of a tree to a rock. But Silas was always a step ahead. He knew the angles, the sight lines. A bullet here, a splinter of rock there. He kept them pinned down. His shots never intended to kill, but to terrify, to demoralize. He was showing them that this ground was his, and on it, he was lethal. Inside, the cabin was filled with the smell of gunpowder and the deafening roar of the rifle. Each shot was a punctuation mark in a violent conversation. Silas moved with a fluid grace, his body remembering the lessons of a past he never spoke of. A brief, brutal stint as an army scout in his youth. The lonely, grieving rancher was gone, replaced by a man of singular, deadly focus. One of Elias's men, growing desperate, made a run for the back of the cabin. It was the one area Silas couldn't easily see from the front, but he had anticipated this. He had left the back window, the one Ilara and the children had escaped through, unboarded. He ran to the back room, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. He saw the man, his back exposed as he fumbled to light another torch near the woodpile. This time, Silas's aim was different. He fired, and the man dropped with a cry of pain, clutching a leg that would no longer hold him. Two men were down, wounded but alive. The third man, the one who had been hiding by the barn, had seen enough. He scrambled back to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and galloped away, not even looking back at his prophet. He had come looking for a holy war, but found only the cold, hard reality of a man defending his home. Elias was now alone. He sat on his horse, his face a mask of disbelief and incandescent rage. His holy army had been dismantled in minutes by a single resolute man. His divine mission was in ruins. He looked at the cabin, a dark, silent fortress that had defied him. He looked at his two wounded followers moaning in the dirt, and his fury, no longer righteous but purely malevolent, settled on Silas. He slid from his horse, pulling a long, wicked-looking knife from his belt. His eyes were no longer those of a prophet, but of a cornered snake. "If my followers cannot fell you, sinner," he hissed, his voice trembling with hate, "then I shall be the instrument of God's own hand." He began to walk toward the cabin, the knife held low, a dark, menacing figure against the gray sky. The final confrontation was at hand. It would not be a battle of rifles at a distance, but a primal face-to-face struggle for survival. Silas stepped out onto the porch to meet him, his rifle now empty and useless in his hand. He tossed it aside. This would not be settled with gunpowder. This was a more personal reckoning. Elias stalked forward, his face a mess of sweat and dirt, his eyes wild. "Where are they, demon?" he snarled. "Where is my family?" "They are not yours," Silas said, his voice a low growl. He stood his ground on the top step of the porch, making himself the final barrier. "You gave up that right when you left them to die. They were being tested, purified," Elias screamed, lunging forward with the knife. Silas moved with a speed that belied his size. He sidestepped the clumsy thrust, his hand shooting out to grab Elias's wrist. The two men crashed together, a tangle of limbs and fury. Elias was wiry and strong with the power of madness, but Silas was grounded, his strength born of hard labor and righteous purpose. They struggled for the knife, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They crashed off the porch and into the mud, grappling for dominance. The knife was the focal point, the flashing piece of steel that would decide the victor. Elias managed to twist his hand, bringing the point of the blade toward Silas's throat. Silas caught his wrist with both hands, his muscles straining to hold back the sharpened point that was just inches from his flesh. He could see the insane glee in Elias's eyes, the thrill of the kill. "I will send you back to hell," Elias grunted, putting all his weight behind the thrust. It was then that a new sound cut through the air, a gunshot. But this one was different. It was sharper, closer. Elias froze, his eyes going wide with shock. A dark red stain began to blossom on his shoulder, the one holding the knife. His grip faltered, the strength going out of his arm. The knife dropped from his nerveless fingers into the mud. Silas looked up, following Elias's stunned gaze. Standing at the edge of the woods not 50 feet away was Elara. She held the spare rifle, the stock pressed against her shoulder, smoke curling from the barrel. Her face was pale as a ghost, her body trembled, but her eyes were filled with a fire that Silas had never seen before. Behind her, peeking from behind the trees, were the 5 small faces of her daughters. She hadn't gone to the cave. She had hidden them, and then she had circled back. She had come back for him. "Get away from him," she said, her voice shaking but clear and strong. Elias stared at her, his mind unable to process what he was seeing. His wife, his meek, obedient property, was holding a rifle on him. She had chosen this demon, over him. "Elara?" he whispered, his voice filled with a hurt, pathetic confusion that was more revealing than his rage had ever been. That single wounded word broke his spirit more than any bullet could have. The fight went out of him. He was not defeated by Silas's strength, but by the shattering of his own delusion. He sank to his knees in the mud, clutching his wounded shoulder, a broken man. Silas got to his feet, breathing heavily. He walked over to Elara, his eyes never leaving hers. He gently took the rifle from her hands. "I told you to go," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "You taught me not to be a victim," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "I will not hide while the man who saved us fights for us." The unspoken words hung in the air between them, more powerful than any declaration. In the aftermath of the violence, with the smell of gunpowder still lingering, something new and beautiful and unbreakable had been forged. Silas turned his attention to Elias, who was now weeping, not from pain, but from the pathetic self-pity of a tyrant who has lost his power. He then looked at the 2 other wounded men, who were watching with fear-filled eyes. His stand was over. The violence was done. He had protected his home. He had protected his new family. The villain was defeated, not just by his fists and his rifle, but by the quiet courage of a woman who had found her own strength. The aftermath was quiet and grim. Silas, his face set, used rope from the barn to tie Elias and his 2 wounded followers. He was firm but not cruel, binding their hands and checking their wounds to ensure they wouldn't bleed out. He was a victor, but he would not become a butcher. Elara brought the girls out from the woods. They were shaken but unharmed, their eyes wide as they took in the scene, the defeated men, the blood in the mud, and the unyielding strength of the 2 adults who had protected them. Clara ran to Elara, burying her face in her mother's skirt, while the younger ones clung to each other, watching Silas with a new kind of awe. "What will you do with them?" Elara asked, her voice low as Silas finished securing the last of the ropes. "The town has a sheriff," Silas said. "He's not much, but he'll know what to do with them. Attempted murder and threatening a family, that's enough to see them in a cell for a long time. Elias's holy mission is over." He loaded the 3 men onto their own horses, tying their feet beneath the animals' bellies. He looked at Elias one last time, seeing not a prophet or a monster, but just a small, pathetic man, stripped of all his power. "Get off my land," Silas said, his voice flat. He slapped the rump of Elias's horse, sending it on its way down the valley toward the town of Providence. The other 2 followed, a miserable procession of failed zealots. As they disappeared over the ridge, a profound silence descended upon the ranch. The tension of the past weeks finally broke, leaving behind an exhausted peace. The sky, as if on cue, began to clear, with rays of golden sunlight breaking through the clouds. Silas turned to Ilara and the children. He looked at his home, the bullet-scarred walls, the splintered porch rail, and then at the family standing before him. He had fought to protect a piece of land, a collection of wood and stone, but he knew in his heart that he had really been fighting for them. Ilara stepped forward, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't say anything. She simply raised a hand and gently touched the bruise that was forming on his cheekbone. In that simple, tender gesture, everything was said. Gratitude, relief, love. The children, seeing that the danger was truly past, finally relaxed. Little Rose, the most fragile of them all, took a tentative step toward Silas. She held up her arms. He hesitated for a moment, his hand stained with the dirt and grime of the fight, before he bent down and lifted her up. She rested her small head on his broad shoulder, her complete, trusting weight a heavier and more precious burden than he had ever known. He stood there, the small child in his arms, with Ilara and her other daughters gathered close. He looked at the cabin, his cabin, and saw it not as a tomb filled with ghosts, but as a home, vibrant and filled with a future. The lonely rancher was no more. In his place stood a husband, a father, a protector. The stand was over, the villains defeated, and on the quiet, sun-drenched land of his ranch, a new family, forged in storm and fire, had finally found its sanctuary. You've just witnessed a story of quiet strength and redemption. If this tale resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Thank you for watching.